Hey everyone, as you come into the meeting, it's great to see everyone. If you can hear me, let me know in the chat. This is my tech check. I want to make sure that everybody can hear me so that I'm not just talking to myself. Great, a hand up, that's a good sign. My tech is working. It's like one of the biggest stresses that I have in life. Thank you, Paula. That my tech won't be working. And Paula, while you've got your hand up, can you see my slides as well? Oh, Anne, I can see you. Can you see my slides or can you see Anne and myself? There's a chat. Let me know and I'll get started. I don't want to be clicking through slides that people can't see. Okay, as you all arrive. Just making sure people can hear me. Got that one hand up and see the slides as well. As you come in, let me know. Oh, here's the Q&A. Yes, can see slides, Narelle. Thank you. And Maggie. All right. Okay. All right. I will get started in that case because we've got a lot to get through on this subject. So today we're talking about governance, protection, and growing bigger, partnerships, documents, and the legal structure that lets you scale. I'm going to start with an acknowledgement of country, and this acknowledgement of country is from my kids' primary school. The year 2-3 class wrote this, and it's my absolute favourite acknowledgement of country, first time sharing it on a ULegal webinar. We play, we dance, we laugh, we cry, on this earth under our feet and under the sky. This is the place, the Kaurna people's land, where we live and we breathe and we walk hand in hand. Thank you, we say, for sharing with us the land you're connected to and the land we all love. One of the special things about doing a webinar is we do get to have you all come in from different lands. So I'm on the Kaurna lands, the traditional lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. And I want to extend the respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. All right. Next, following that beautiful poem, the disclaimer: this presentation is for general guidance only. Legal advice should be taken in relation to taking actions on specific issues. So let's go. Who am I? My name's Sarah Bartholomeusz. I'm the principal of ULegal. We're a law firm that supports medical and allied health professionals to create businesses that protect them, protect the business, and create value for the owners in the future. So that's our big thing. That's the topic of today's webinar, really about growing and doing so with protection. I've run the business for 13 years now, and I come from a family of medical and allied health professionals. So it's a cohort of people that I care very deeply about and had seen things not going great from my family members when engaging professional services people. So very passionate about protecting businesses, creating value for the future. And we absolutely love working with people who help people at ULegal. Lawyers can't always say that they're working to have a healthier Australia, which is what we believe we do in strengthening your businesses through governance. I've also written a book, which I've just dropped on the floor, called Growing a Medical Practice from Frustration to a High Performance Business. It's available on our website with free postage, on Amazon if you feel like paying more, or also on Amazon Audible if you have Audible credits you'd like and you want to hear me reading to you. There's another opportunity. All right, let's see how we go with this webinar first, shall we? Who this webinar is for practice owners and practice managers who are considering bringing in partners or restructuring ownership, expanding into multiple sites or diversifying service lines. Not if you haven't formalised your partnership or shareholders arrangement, this is for you. If you haven't formally protected your brand or intellectual property, this is also for you. And then if you're planning for growth, scale, or future sale in the next 3 to 4 years as well, this could be for you. What you're going to leave with is an understanding of how to structure your practice for growth and scalability, which many practices don't necessarily set up with that in mind. So it's a good time to start thinking about it if you're on this webinar, even if it's not immediate. Identifying gaps in your current ownership and governance arrangements, learning what you need to do to protect your brand and intellectual property, gaining clarity on how to reduce risk while you're expanding, which is one of those things I've mentioned I'm very passionate about, and then understanding how strong governance can support long-term value creation in your practice. I'm just putting up a time because this time goes so quickly. All right. What I want to take you through in the first instance is the practice life cycle stages. And so these are the stages of any medical or allied health practice. You start, and in that case, you set up your structure, you set up the structure in terms of how you engage with practitioners, how you engage with staff, the setup of how you are going to run the practice, and then succession. So you might at the start, if you've already talked to us, be thinking about succession and how you'll grow and sell the practice in the future. It's a great time to start thinking about that. But in between start and scale, there is a stabilized time. You don't necessarily want to jump straight from start to scale unless you've got a lot of money behind you, and love living in chaos all the time. Scale, there is 3 elements to scale as well: staffing, services, and sites. And then in between scale and strengthen, there's stabilize as well. So what we're going to be talking about today really is the strengthen opportunity, scale and strengthen. So staffing, services, sites, and then stabilize between scale and strengthen, but systems, standards, and security. So we're going to go do a deep dive into those items and start with just saying growth doesn't necessarily mean sustainability. So most practice owners really view growth as a positive indicator of success. More practitioners, broader service offerings, and increasing revenue generally suggest to most practitioners that the practice is moving in the right direction. However, one of the most important observations we've made working with growing healthcare businesses is that growing a practice and strengthening a practice aren't necessarily the same thing. A practice can scale from very, very successfully from a commercial perspective, while the legal and governance framework supporting it remain largely unchanged. In the early stages, this doesn't create any obvious issues. The owners know each other well and decisions are made informally and fairly quickly. Everyone's aligned around a common vision. But growth changes the operational reality of the business. As the practice becomes larger and more complex, those informal arrangements are often placed under increasing pressure. When we talk about scaling a healthcare practice, we're usually talking about growth in one or more of 3 areas. The first is staffing. So that might mean bringing on more practitioners, employing more support staff, appointing a practice manager, or creating a more layered management structure. The second is services. As practices grow, they often expand beyond their original service offering. That may involve adding new disciplines, introducing new models of care, or creating a broader patient offering. The third is sites. So growth might also involve opening a second location, using additional rooms, expanding into a larger premises, or even acquiring another clinic. Each of these can be a really positive sign that the practice is growing, but each one changes the legal and governance pressure points in the business. More staff mean that roles need to be clearer. And maybe you have people saying, well, that's not my job. But employment documents and management authority might need to change or be implemented. More services can raise questions around scope, branding, practitioner arrangements, and risk. More sites mean the practice needs systems that work consistently across locations, not just informal arrangements that depend on one owner being across everything. So the key point is that scale is not about making things bigger. It is about making sure the legal structure, documents, and governance frameworks are strong enough to support the way the practice is actually growing. The challenge is that growth changes far more than revenue. It changes how the practice operates. Additional owners may be introduced. New locations may be opened. Different service lines may be added. Senior managers may become involved in the business. Over time, the practice becomes significantly more sophisticated than it was when it first started. What may have worked when there were 2 owners and 1 location often becomes far less effective when there are multiple stakeholders and a much larger operation. One of the most common issues we see in practices successfully increasing revenue and scale while the ownership framework, governance systems, and legal protection remain several years behind the complexity of the business itself, which you definitely do not want, but is very common because you're busy and scaling can be a very crazy time in terms of owner commitment and practice manager priorities. This is where many practices do, unfortunately, begin experiencing challenges. The issue is rarely a lack of commercial success. The issue is often that the structure hasn't evolved alongside the business. As complexity increases, uncertainty begins to emerge around who controls what, how decisions should be made, how information should be protected, and what happens if circumstances change. We're also seeing increased regulatory focus on the practical reality of business arrangements. Recent legislative reforms have reinforced that regulators are increasingly interested in how businesses actually operate in practice rather than simply what the documents say. Ultimately, growth should create value, but without the right ownership structures, governance framework, and legal protections, growth can just as easily create risk. Once we recognize that growth creates complexity, the question becomes, what actually needs to be in place? In our experience, most growth-related legal issues fall into one of 4 categories: ownership, governance, protection, and risk management. These 4 foundations are addressed early. Practices are usually, if these 4 foundations are addressed early, practices are usually able to scale far more effectively and with significantly less friction. So I'm going to go through each of these now one by one. The first foundation is ownership. Most practices begin with strong relationships between owners. Expectations around contributions, profit distribution, management responsibilities, future plans are often understood but not always documented. That tends to work while the practice is small. It becomes much harder once the practice grows. Most practices start with a relatively small ownership group. Over time, however, owner roles often evolve. One owner may focus on operations, another may remain primarily clinical, another may reduce involvement altogether. The issue is not whether those arrangements are right or wrong. The issue is whether they have been clearly documented and agreed upon. As the value of the practice increases, uncertainty around ownership can become increasingly expensive. Many medical practices begin with a strong level of trust and alignment between owners. Decisions around contributions, management responsibilities, profit distribution, and future plans are often discussed and mutually understood, but not always documented in detail. While these may seem to work in the earlier stages of a practice, these issues begin to emerge as the practice grows and operational complexity around the practice increases. As revenue increases and owner roles begin to change and evolve, informal assumptions start to break down. One owner may be managing operations, another may be contributing primarily clinically, and another may begin stepping back while retaining equity. If these expectations have never been documented properly, disagreement becomes much more likely. And what I've found in terms of our recent engagement with practices are two that come to mind. One, a practice that we previously did their shareholders agreement, and they've now been working with that shareholders agreement for a year. They've got somebody they'd like to invite into an equity holders position, and they've come to us with a list of things that they'd like updated in the shareholders agreement. And they also have an engagement document that is one that the owner doctors use. So it's a services agreement that's different than is used with independent practitioners because they're not independent, and they've got some changes that they've outlined that they'd like to make with that before they bring on the next person. So it's an evolving thing as they grow. Another practice that's come to us recently is a two-owner practice. They own their practice and they own the building that the practice is in, and they've got one shareholders agreement that covers both, because at the moment it's always been that they both own both, but they know that in the future, if they want to bring in another practitioner, or if they want to sell the practice outright to someone independent from them, that those items should be dealt with in separate agreements, because there's separate legal entities involved. And so with them, we're currently doing a review of the existing arrangements and strategically thinking about what might come next, so that what they put in place is right for the next stage of the business. So that's just some examples of how we work with practices in this space. Now I'm going to explain what are owner agreements. And so I use the term owner agreements, as it says on this slide, for an agreement which might be called a shareholders agreement, it might be a partnership agreement, it might be an equity holders agreement if it's a company trustee and there's a shareholder like shares that or units. So it depends on the structure as to what we call it. And then we also do separate buy-sell agreements, which are insurance backed if in certain circumstances, if there's a policy that the owners have in place. So one of the first concepts to really understand governance and growth is the role of this agreement. It is a document that establishes the rules for how the business is owned, managed, and operated between the owners. So it's an agreement between the entity and the owners. And then the owners might be slightly different from the doctors that also have the arrangement with the practice. So there's a lot of different legal entities, which when you're new to practice ownership can be a bit confusing. I know, I remember that starting my own practice 13 years ago and having all these entities to understand what they did. But having the clarity around that from a governance perspective is critical. And this document really is critical because it outlines what will happen when circumstances change. Hence the example of the practitioners that have come back to us after a year, having reviewed it and now knowing how they want it to look as a new practitioner into the business. So the specific type of agreement really depends on the structure of the practice, as I explained, and even the name of the document changes, they do all serve a similar purpose. It's important to understand that the appropriate agreement will depend on the legal structure through which the practice operates. As a practice grows, ownership becomes more valuable, decision-making becomes more complex, and the consequences of uncertainty can become greater. Owner agreements provide the framework that sits behind how the business is governed and how key ownership issues are managed. They commonly deal with who owns what, who has authority to make decisions, how new owners can be introduced, what happens when an owner leaves, how disputes can be resolved, and how ownership interests are valued and transferred. Rather than relying on informal understandings, These agreements provide a structured framework for managing change as the practice evolves. These issues, honestly, that I've set out on this slide are surprisingly common. In fact, many successful practices operate for years and years without formally addressing them. The difficulty is that these issues often remain hidden until a trigger event occurs. And a trigger event, how do I define that? An owner wishes to leave, a dispute arises, a new investor becomes involved, the practice begins considering sale or succession, or even one of the owners gets a divorce and there needs to be a valuation. So at all of these points, uncertainty can become very, very visible. So now you understand why you need an owner's agreement. Foundation 2 is governance, because growth really requires greater role clarity. Governance can be misunderstood. While, of course, as medical and health professionals, you really understand the role of clinical governance, and some people just think it's just an extension of that. Many people really, in a small business context, hear governance and think about large corporations. But in reality, governance, in my view, creates clarity. So clarity around authority, accountability, decision-making. As a practice grows, governance becomes increasingly important because more decisions affect more people and aspects of the business. Staffing, expansion, service offerings as you grow. One of the most common issues in growing practices is uncertainty around authority. Everyone assumes someone else is responsible, or alternatively, too many people are involved in every decision, and that's where decisions start to slow down and you get analysis paralysis. Neither approach scales effectively. Governance creates certainty around who can do what, and it can create simplification in doing that. It becomes particularly important when a practice is expanding into multiple sites or diversifying its service lines. For example, if a new location is being opened, who has authority to approve what in that decision? Because there are a lot of decisions that come with opening a new practice and fitting it out. Who signs off on the lease, staffing model, budget for the fit out, and branding? If a new service line is introduced, who decides how it will be structured? Who will deliver it, and what documents or compliance steps are required? These questions often seem operational, but it becomes harder to rely on informal conversations or assumptions between owners. Clear governance helps ensure that growth decisions are made consistently and with the right authority, and in a way that supports the long-term value of the business. We often see growing practices experiencing what we call governance drag. The business becomes harder to operate because decision-making structures haven't evolved with the growth. I think that might be a theme of today's webinar. Good governance should support efficient decision-making, not slow it down. Effective governance is fundamentally about clarity around authority, accountability, decision-making, not complexity. The best governance frameworks create confidence. Owners who know their role, management knows its authority, decisions can be made efficiently, growth becomes easier to manage. Foundation 3 is protection. As practices grow, they often become increasingly valuable for reasons beyond revenue. Brand reputation grows, referral networks strengthen, systems and processes improve. Commercial information becomes increasingly valuable. These assets require protection. One misconception we frequently encounter is that registering a business name protects a brand, and people think when another practice pops up with a similar name that's going to protect it. But let me tell you here today, if this is a piece of takeaway value you get from today, is your business name doesn't protect your business name. A business name and a trademark are very different. As a practice grows, the brand becomes one of its most valuable assets. Protecting that asset should really be part of your growth strategy. Buyers and investors are interested in what assets they're acquiring, and a protected brand is often significantly more valuable than an unprotected one. It creates certainty around ownership and use of the brand moving forward. Confidential information is also a very important thing to protect. As practices scale, they become more collaborative. They engage consultants, software providers, investors, acquisition targets, referral partners. Information begins moving outside the practice. And while this creates opportunity, it also creates risk. One thing with confidential information that I tell people is that Coke, very important confidential information, is the ingredients, of course, in Coca-Cola, and that is still confidential. But if you Google the 11 herbs and spices of KFC, that's on the internet. And once it's out in the public domain, it can't be put back in the box. So the way to protect your IP in terms of confidentiality agreement is really through confidentiality agreements and non-disclosure agreements. Many practices focus very heavily on protecting patient information, but maybe there's a lot fewer that focus on protecting the commercial information that you have. And both are incredibly valuable. So confidentiality protections help preserve value and negotiating leverage. Instead of waiting for information to be shared, the better approach is putting protection in place before disclosures occur. Foundation 4 is risk. So as you grow, your risk profile changes. So one of the biggest mistakes that we do see is treating growth as a commercial factor. Growth should also trigger legal reviews. Recent reforms continue to focus on the operational reality of your practice, not just what is in the documents, practical substance, and genuine business structures. Practices can no longer rely on legacy arrangements or agreements simply because they've existed for years. So expansion should really trigger a legal review because the risk profile changes as a business grows. If the practice is adding sites, the question is whether the existing ownership structure, management, authority, leases, employment documents, and practitioner arrangements can work across more than one location. If the practice is diversifying services, is it appropriate that the existing documents properly deal with this new service offering and that the people delivering those services, use of the brand, patient relationships, confidentiality and compliance obligations are all correctly in place? The key point is that legal documents shouldn't be static. They need to reflect how the practice actually operates now, not how it did when it was smaller. I thought this was quite a good example that's come across our desks recently, where an online physio practice we assisted wanted to really scale their practice. The practice was growing quickly, expanding its services and building out its team. They had an employment agreement in place, but it was a generic document obtained from an industry association. And while it gave them a starting point, it didn't properly reflect how the practice was operated or where it was heading, particularly because it had a little bit of a difference to it being online. As the team expanded, the practice needed clearer terms and roles around expectations, responsibilities, confidentiality, and compliance. We reviewed and tailored the agreement so it aligned with the practice's operating model, values, and legal requirements. The result was a highly satisfied client. The revised employment agreement provided greater clarity, transparency, and legal protection for all parties involved and enabled the practice to continue its growth with confidence. Growth often exposes gaps in documents that might have seemed adequate when the practice was smaller. As services expand and more people become involved, the legal framework needs to become more specific, not more generic. So look, I'm coming to the end of my time very quickly. Revenue growth doesn't create long-term value. Sustainable growth requires governance, protection, structure, and scalability. The strongest practices are not necessarily those with the most complex structures. They're the practices that review and adapt their structures as the business evolves. Governance, protection, and ownership frameworks should not be static. Amplifying value isn't simply increasing revenue, it's increasing attractiveness and transferability of the business. Buyers, if you're thinking about exit, whether it's an internal buyer or an external buyer, pay premiums for scalable systems, low risk operations, and sustainable revenue models. Here is my details. Feel free to get in touch and book an appointment if you would like to. We'll also give you that opportunity in a follow-up email we send. And this is the way we work with practices. We really align so that we're all on the same page, protect the business, and then amplify its value and give you something what you're spending your time for in the future. We also have this Facebook group, and I want to take questions. I know my 30 minutes is up, but I'll stick around and take questions. Or if you want to tell me your number one feedback in terms of your takeaways that you're going to go back and action now, I'd love to hear that. So I'm going to stop sharing, if I can work out how to, because I am not a tech genius. Let me see. Have I stopped sharing? Yes, I think I have. Okay. All right. I can see there's questions. In the Q&A. No additional questions, just people saying they can hear me, which is great. Feel free to reach out with questions, pop a question in the chat, your takeaways, whatever. I'd love to hear from you. We had a great number of people register for today's webinar. So this hand, I think, is that you can hear me. Thank you, Larry. All right, well, it looks like we are all good for today. Thank you for your comment, Ben and Tanya. And yeah, hope you got something out of today. Looking forward to being in touch with our next webinar next month as well.